Much, Mr. Speaker. It is a privilege to rise to speak on Bill C-46, the government's alcohol and drug-impaired driving legislation. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to study Bill C-46 at the Justice Committee. One thing that was very, very clear coming out of the Justice Committee, based upon the evidence from a number of witnesses, is that law enforcement isn't ready to implement aspects of Bill C-46 related to drug impairment in time for the government's arbitrary and rushed July 1st, 2018 timeline to legalize marijuana. Mr. Speaker, once Bill C-46 is passed, it will require that some 65,000 police officers across Canada get trained and understand Bill C-46. That's going to take time, and it's going to be costly. Mr. Speaker, we heard the need for some 2,000 drug recognition experts. At present, there are only 600 drug recognition experts in Canada. And Mr. Speaker, in answer to a question that I posed to Department of Public Safety officials at the Justice Committee, it appears that only approximately 100 more drug recognition experts will be trained by July 1st, 2018. Mr. Speaker, then there are issues surrounding per se limits for THC. Whether these per se limits are appropriate, what the per se limits should be. Mr. Speaker, this government hasn't addressed that yet. 9 months until the July 1st rollout. There are serious questions about, of course, the correlation between THC levels and drug impairment. On the question of public awareness, the Marijuana Task Force, as part of the public health approach that it took, called upon the government to launch an immediate and sustained public awareness campaign. Mr. Speaker, where is the campaign? It has not been sustained. It has not been fully rolled out. And Mr. Speaker, we're just 9 months away. And so, given these and other reasons, it's no wonder that the law enforcement community has called upon the government to delay the legalization of marijuana beyond July 1st, 2018. After all, law enforcement won't have the tools, resources, and time to deal with the multiplicity of issues that will arise from legalization. And it really is, quite frankly, frustrating that, notwithstanding that very resounding message, this government refuses to back down and is moving full steam ahead with legalization, even though law enforcement won't have the tools, won't have the resources, and won't have the time to keep our roads safe. So what is that going to mean for the health and safety of Canadians? Well, Mr. Speaker, when legalization occurs, more and more Canadians are going to use marijuana. That is a fact. And as a result, there will be more drug-impaired drivers. And without the tools and resources and training to enforce the laws, including laws that would come on the books once Bill C-46 is passed, it's going to mean more injuries, more deaths, and more carnage on our roads. And Mr. Speaker, this government will bear partial responsibility for those injuries, those deaths, and that carnage that is sure to ensue. Now, Mr. Speaker, with respect to Part 2 of Bill C-46, which deals with alcohol-impaired driving and would make a number of changes to the criminal code respecting alcohol-impaired driving, I must say that I congratulate the government for some of the measures that they have introduced. Bill C-46 will eliminate certain defenses that have been abused by impaired drivers. It will increase the maximum penalty for impaired driving causing bodily harm from 10 years to 14 years. Mr. Speaker, that's welcome. But I have to say, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that Bill C-46 does not tackle the most serious offense related to impaired driving, and that is impaired driving causing death. Bill C-46 does absolutely nothing to strengthen penalties for impaired driving causing death. Now, Mr. Speaker, one might say, well, if you look at the criminal code, the maximum sentence for impaired driving causing death is life behind bars. It sounds pretty good. It sounds appropriate that that should be the maximum penalty. The only difficulty with that, Mr. Speaker, is that very, very few individuals convicted of impaired driving causing death are sentenced to life behind bars. In fact, I'm not aware of a single case. There may be one or two, but I'm not aware of one. And if there are any cases, that is a rare, rare exception to the rule. What we see instead are impaired drivers who go out and get behind a 2,000 or 3,000 pound weapon and take the life of one or more human beings as a result of that, their choice to drink and drive, get off with a slap on the wrist. Mr. Speaker, we saw there was a case in Saskatchewan involving a mother and her son who were killed by an impaired driver. The individual responsible, do you know what he got? He got a $4,000 fine, not 1 day behind bars, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there have been cases where individuals have walked free with as little as a $1,500 fine. A $1,500 fine for being responsible for taking the life of another human being. Mr. Speaker, that's a joke. That is an absolute joke. It is fundamentally unfair, and it is fundamentally unjust. And it is why, Mr. Speaker, more than 100,000 Canadians have signed a petition calling for Parliament to act. It's why the victims' families who came before the Justice Committee called upon this Parliament to take steps to move forward with mandatory sentences. It's why our previous Conservative government introduced Bill C-73, which would have provided for a 6-year mandatory sentence for impaired drivers who kill. And it's why I introduced an amendment to Bill C-46 at the Justice Committee to provide for a mandatory sentence of at least 5 years, which was the minimum sentence that the victims who appeared before our committee asked for, Mr. Speaker. And yet, sadly, every single Liberal MP voted against that common sense amendment. And it's one thing to vote against an amendment, but they didn't even try. They didn't even put up an alternative. They just shrugged their shoulders and accepted the status quo. Mr. Speaker, the victims and their families deserve better from this government on Bill C-46. And so I'm hopeful that once this bill is passed, as it inevitably will be through this House, given that we have a majority government, that the Senate can get to work to try to improve this bill, to try to fix this bill, and help ensure that at the end of the day, the victims will finally be able to have some justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to share with the member opposite. When the National MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving President, Mrs. Patricia Hines Coates, came before our committee and she was asked about mandatory minimum sentences, this is what she said. As a mom, as a stepmom, and as a victim, I cannot support it. There's no evidence to support that this will actually make a difference. We know once we bury our children or bury a loved one, it's too late. We need to focus on deterring it before it actually happens. And also, Mr. Speaker, I also wanted to quote Mr. Andrew Murray, who's the CEO of MAD Canada, who in earlier testimony in regards to a previous Conservative bill that proposed to bring in 6-year mandatory sentences, he said this: penalties that only happen after somebody is dead don't stop drunk drivers from getting behind the wheel. It will have zero effect. He went on to emphasize that his organization would rather see an emphasis on deterrence. And Mr. Speaker, that's precisely what Bill C-46 has focused on. Now, I would also remind the member that the mandatory minimums that he quotes as being applying only to impaired causing death were actually robustly discussed by the Justice Committee applying to all impaired offences. But, Mr. Speaker, we know that where the evidence supports an appropriately severe sentence for someone who has taken a life, the courts have all the authority that they will require in this legislation to make sure justice is done.
Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in response to the question from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice, it is, MAD certainly has their position, but there have been numerous witnesses who lost their sons and daughters who implored the committee to move forward with mandatory sentences. It's why more than 114,000 Canadians signed a petition that was organized by mothers who lost their loved ones to impaired drivers, and that petition of more than 114,000 Canadians came together in just a matter of weeks, Mr. Speaker, because Canadians see the injustice, victims see the injustice, and with respect to mandatory minimums or mandatory sentences, in addition to deterrence, which I would beg to suggest that they would have an impact on deterrence, but beyond deterrence, mandatory sentences are consistent with other sentencing principles under the Criminal Code, including denunciation and promoting responsible behaviour.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my friend and colleague from St. Albert, Edmonton, for his articulate speech and for his passion. This is very important legislation, and it needs to be held under the greatest scrutiny, and I appreciate his energy and efforts. His party has stated that there is no good test out there for marijuana-impaired driving. The Mothers Against Drunk Driving Canada has endorsed the idea of per se limits. Does the member agree that per se limits should be based on a scientific approach?
Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend, the member for Courtenay Alberni, for that good question. Absolutely, that any per se limit should be based upon science. And one of the real issues is that there is not a clear correlation between drug impairment and THC limits. So, for example, long-term habitual users of THC will tend to have higher levels of THC because THC will remain in their bodies, whereas someone who may have just consumed marijuana but is not a habitual user and then gets behind the wheel may actually record relatively low levels of THC. And so one of the difficulties is the fact that someone who is impaired might not be caught by the per se limit, whereas someone who really isn't impaired might be caught, and that's a problem.
Just time for one more short question and response. The Honourable Member for Caribou, Prince George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to rise today. And I want to speak from the perspective of a family that lost somebody that got behind the wheel, or because somebody chose to get behind the wheel and drive while impaired. My brother, 27 years ago, my brother Fabian was killed by a drunk driver, so I can speak with some authority in knowing the pain that the families go through. And that you never ever recover. It's always a loss in your life. And I know that the person that got behind the wheel has to live with it every day, Mr. Speaker, that he actually killed my brother. But I want to speak to a part about this bill that the Liberals are rushing this through. They haven't thought it through. We know that the municipalities and the provinces are going to be on the hook for paying for this. and the costs are going to be downloaded. And through you, Mr. Speaker, to our honourable colleague, this is such a major concern that we're seeing this time and again that they're not really thinking these things through, and really they're going to download the responsibility to the provinces and municipality to enforce these laws. And I'd like to hear his comments on that.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you to my friend from Prince George, Caribou, and I know the tragic circumstances surrounding his brother being killed by an impaired driver, and I know that member is just a real passionate advocate around this issue. But the member is right on the question of implementation and enforcement, and the fact that costs are being downloaded onto the provinces and municipalities. It speaks again to the fact that this government doesn't have a plan. And it's why not only is the law enforcement community asking for the government to delay legalization of marijuana, it has also been many provinces and municipalities who are calling the government to slow down, to consult, and develop a plan before ramming this through by July 1st.